everybody again, and as I have a great pleasure to introduce you to Mike Bowler, who is going to be our guest speaker tonight. I met Mike, I don't know, Mike, how many years ago? I was trying to remember.
20 maybe?
Like 20 something. There used to be here in Toronto a group called XP Toronto, and it was the gathering place for people trying all this new thing called Agile at the time. And at the time, Mike was already a participant. He was already one of the pioneers introducing Agile with the people he was working with. So he had been doing this for some time. But when I met him, and he was one of the people that was a reference when it came to Agile. And since then, I know he has been doing lots of work with many companies and many people and many teams. He's a technical coach. So he can help people. He's one of those coaches who can sit with developers and help them with code, not just with other practices or metrics as he will be talking about tonight, but with the technical aspect of Agile. And I know that in recent times he also has been venturing in other things like psychology and human behavior. I'm sure he will be touching on that at some time. He now lives in Kelowna. That's in the western side of the country for those of you who are not here. So he's on the Pacific side, and he's joining us from there. So with no much introduction, Mike, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. All right. So what we're going to be talking tonight about how we get metrics out of Jira. I'm very specifically focused on how I do it with a tool that I wrote that I have given away. It's an open source tool. I give it away for free. We're not going to talk about how you configure it. There is a quick start guide for that. You're going to get links to how you actually configure it. But what we're going to look at today is what can we pull out of Jira? What are those things we could do, and what decisions might we be able to make based on the data that we pull out? It's great to have a whole bunch of numbers, but if we don't know what decisions we can make, those numbers are a lot less useful. So if you've been playing with Jira at all, you'll realize how poor the existing reports are. And I'll rant for a few moments about how badly they work at the moment. But the key is that Jira has a tremendous amount of really good information internally. And if we can just pull it out, we can do some really interesting things with it. So let's start off with the two charts that Jira provides out of the box. It does provide a couple of other widgets here and there, but these are the two main charts that everybody goes towards when they're starting to look at metrics. This is the Jira control chart, which is the one that an astounding number of people go to first, even though nobody really knows how to read it. If you look at the y-axis down the side, for example, sometimes it's in a linear scale and sometimes it's in a cube root power scale, and you really have to read the fine print to figure out what it's doing. So it might be exponential and it might be linear, and it's really hard to tell at a glance. We've also got this big shaded area in the back that is theoretically standard deviation, except standard deviation makes no sense unless you have a standard distribution of work, and we don't here. The kind of work that we're talking about follows a Weibull distribution, which means that the work, if we were to graph it out, the work would pack far more to the left instead of being the standard, bell curve that we're used to. So the standard distribution works great with a bell curve. It does not work with a Weibull distribution, and yet Jira decides to show you this as if it had some meaning, but it doesn't. The next chart that everybody looks at is the Jira's cumulative flow, which is actually a tremendously useful chart that, again, most people don't know how to read. I tend not to use a lot of cumulative flows simply because although there is a lot of good information there, they're difficult to read unless you're really quite experienced with this. But my problem with Jira's cumulative flow is that they draw it incorrectly. When we look at the chart, by definition, it's not possible for a line to go down. It's cumulative. Lines can only go upwards, and yet in a Jira chart, like you can see where the arrow is, it does go down occasionally. So the chart is wrong as well as being difficult to read. And yet these are the two that most people go to when they're trying to get their metrics out of Jira. So we're going to be looking at far better metrics. Now, the downside is that this does mean we have to use an external tool that pulls stuff out through the API. So it's not quite as seamless as just going to a dashboard and seeing it right there, but we can get much better information and we can make some really good decisions based on that information. But before we get into the actual charts themselves, I want to talk about data quality, because it's really important that the charts that we've got are only as good as the data that goes into them. I love these two diagrams that are on the left. These are diagrams around predicting hurricanes and where they're going to go. This is a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about, because this would be doing Monte Carlo simulations to figure out the path of the hurricane. But the point is that on the top left diagram, we've got really good predictable data. Sure, there's outliers that go in different directions, but most of the data fundamentally follows the same path. The data is good, it's accurate, and it's highly predictable. The data in the bottom left chart is a complete disaster. The data is all over the place. There's no way we could make a good prediction on this. And yet, when we look at the charts, if we just looked at numbers, we wouldn't be able to tell at a glance whether the data was good or not. So we need to be able to talk about data quality. And a lot of the problems that when we go into built-in charts is that they don't tell us what the quality was. It says, here's a chart, and we're expected to just believe what's in there. And we do intrinsically believe it because of our own cognitive biases. And then we trust that we have the right answer, but often we don't because the data is incorrect. So the first thing that my tool does is it talks a little bit about the data quality. And we'll get to that in just a second about the kinds of things we're doing. But I do want to point out one thing on this chart. We've got these orangish links down here. Every place that you see one of these on a page, that is a clickable link that will take you to an article talking about that subject. So this is just more information. So this is part of why you have access directly to the Miro board, that if you're interested in this particular topic, just click on one of those and it'll take you to something more. So this is what the data quality report looks like. So at the beginning, the whole report is one long HTML page that you can just scroll through, and it's got tons and tons of information in it. But at the very top, we talk about data quality. And here's an example. This is off a real report that came out of Jira directly. We can see that in this particular data set, 23 items were discarded from all the charts, including that use cycle time. So that would be your scatter plot, your histogram, etc., because we couldn't determine when they started. We know when they finished. They finished on a specific day, but we have no idea when they started. And so a cognitive bias called survivorship bias causes us to believe in whatever we see. But if it turns out that we only had data from 10% of the original data points, then the data we're looking at is not useful for making good decisions. Now, in this case, we have 73% of the total data points, and that might be good enough to make some good decisions, or it might not, but that's a judgment call we have to make. So the point is, if we don't understand how good our data is, we don't know whether or not we can trust the charts. So the second item here is we had 63 items had a status change after being identified as done. So we got to done, we stopped the clock, but then something else happened. And there was another status change that happened afterwards. And that might be okay, but it might not. The tool can't tell whether this is acceptable or not. And so it calls it out as a warning. We have 6 items that moved backwards. And what I'm showing here is that if you had clicked on the show details, it will tell you exactly what tickets and what the items were that moved through. I'm not going to walk through all of the different things. There's a lot of different things that it checks for, 9 specifically different kinds of things that it looks for, but it gives you this data quality report right at the top. So when you're looking at, for example, a scatter plot or a histogram, and we're going to walk through all of those charts, you need to remember that the data you're looking at may not be as accurate as you think it is, and you need to look at the data quality first to see whether or not you can trust what you're seeing. Okay, so let's actually get to some metrics. The first things that I like to talk about when I'm digging into metrics are the basic flow metrics, which are work in progress, throughput, work item age, and cycle time. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time digging into each one. I expect that this being a Kanban meetup that you're at least familiar with the terms. Work in progress is how many items we have in progress. Throughput is how many have completed in a unit of time, etc. But these are the 4 that I usually start with. So I want to look at charts that tell me about these pieces of information first. Once I've got my flow metrics, then I might look at other things, and we'll get to some of the other things we can pull out. Because there's actually a lot of interesting stuff we can get from Jira. So let's take a look at the first one, the Cycletime Scatterplot. So what this is telling us is for this data set, every item every dot on here is a work item that passed through the system. It's either a story or a task. And I know that because the legends up here indicate the green are stories and blue are tasks. If we had another type, like a bug, it would show up in a different color. And so every one of those dots tells us not only what day did the work finish on, but how old was that work at the time it closed. So what was the total cycle time? If it started yesterday and it finished today, that's 2. If it started today and finished today, that's a 1. Just how many days was it in progress? And so by looking at this, we can start to see trends. We can see, first of all, that our data is relatively stable. We can see some trend lines moving across on the dashed lines. And that tells me that because it's almost horizontal, it's not perfectly horizontal, it's a little bit angled, but because it's roughly horizontal, our data is fairly predictable. If these trend lines were swooping up or swooping down, then I would know that I couldn't trust this data for doing any kind of a prediction for what's coming. So we can look at this and we can start to make decisions. This appears to be stable, even though we have some older outliers. Up here, 27, 28, 30 days. We've got some outliers that are taking longer. Our data appears to be fairly predictable. 85% of the stories are finishing on or under 8 days. And so we've got some good information we can make decisions about. I will point out that the first time you show this data to a team, the numbers will not be this good, because until you see the data, they've had no incentive to keep the data accurate. So when I first show this to a team, it's not uncommon to have cycle times in the hundreds of days, because there's stuff that they've just kept open for a really long time because they haven't cared to keep the data as accurate as they should have. So somebody mentioned during the debrief about the accuracy of the data. Well, showing them how they can make useful decisions out of the data is a great first step towards getting people to care about the accuracy of it. So now once we see the charts and we're able to see what decisions we can make off it, they're more inclined to keep the data accurate. We'll close things when they really did close. We'll move the items on the board when we need to. The gray bars in the background are just weekends, so we can tell at a glance how many weeks we're looking at. This happens to be 90 days worth of data, although I could have configured it to go back 1,000 days if I wanted. I find 90 days is a reasonable compromise between recent enough that it reflects what the team is doing today, but also a large enough data set that I can start to see patterns.
Sorry, Mike. We have a question
Yes.
here. Somebody saying, Kadrin is saying, curious how you calculate the trend lines.
The trend lines are, well, it's all based on the data. And honestly, I don't remember what the actual formula was. I had to go and look it up in a book. But this is the standard calculation that Excel and such use for trend lines. And I can't remember the exact formula off the top of my head.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, somebody asked which book. I think you just said is the Excel formula.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly where I found it, but I did spend some time digging into that because I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So I found somebody else's formula and I used that.
So it's probably it's not a correlation. It's well, I will remember later.
It's an Excel function. It's an Excel function that you add into the plot and a pivot, using a pivot table, and you could add the function trend line calculation.
Mm-hmm.
Effectively, except it's not actually talking to Excel on the back end. But yes, I'm using the same approach that Excel uses.
Yeah. All right.
The solid lines are the 85% line. So 85% of the work is on or below that line. There's nothing magical about 85% other than it's a reasonable proxy for most. So most of the work, most of the stories finished in 8 days or less. Most of the tasks finished in 2 days or less. Depending on your data set, you might say that 85 is the wrong number for me. I'd rather see it plotting 50%, or I'd rather see it plotting 90%, and that's all configurable. Just out of the box, it does 85%. All right, so let's move along to the next chart. We've got a Cycletime histogram. So it's the same data that we're talking about. It's cycle times. How many days was the work in progress? But now we're looking at a histogram. So we can see that a lot of the items, 80 of the items, or 80-ish, completed in 1 day. And we can see about 40 completed in 2 days, and a lot fewer completed in 3 days. And we can start to see some patterns here. Now, in sort of Fresh breaking news, Fernando had published a post on LinkedIn this morning talking about how you would determine the different work item types out of a histogram. And so this link up here is a link to that up in the top right. So if you want to go and see what he was saying about that this morning, this will give you a sense. In this data here, we can very clearly say that there are at least 2 different types of work items. There's the work items here that are taking 1 or 2 days, and there's work items here. There might be a third one way out here, but there really aren't enough data points to say for sure if this is actually another work item type or if this is just an outlier of some kind. But it's giving us some indication, at least 2, possibly 3 different types of work. Then we can look at throughput. Now, when I graph throughput, I like to graph 2 different aspects to it. Throughput is just the number of items that have completed in a period of time. So in this case, it's every Monday morning, how many items have completed since the previous Monday morning. So all of our data points are on Mondays. On the top chart, I am graphing by the actual work item type. And on the bottom graph, I'm graphing by how it was closed. So sometimes we actually completed the work, sometimes we canceled the work and didn't finish it properly, sometimes we closed it as a duplicate. There's lots of reasons why we might want to close the work, and so I find it useful to graph both what the item was and also how we completed it. But this is, again, all configurable. The dashed line is the totals, and then the individual breakdowns by the type of work. Moving along a little bit, so that first item was all about cycle time. I said we're going through the 4 flow metrics to start with. So the next one is aging work in progress. So this is work that has started but is not finished. And this chart is for one specific board. So it's okay for one team to have multiple boards, and the report can reflect that. So you can have multiple boards on a single report. But this chart is just for one board. And it's reflecting in the development column, we have 3 items that are currently active at varying ages. And we can see that we have an 85% line again here. And what this tells us is that all of the items that have passed across this board in this period of time, this 90 days, 85% of them left that column while it was still within the gray area. So by definition, these 2 here are outliers. And this one here is probably okay. I'm not concerned about the one that's in here because it's likely going to finish in time. But the 2 out here are already outliers, and they're still in the first column of development there. So that's something that if I looked at this chart during stand-up, I would say I want to give my focus to these older items because they're already cause for concern. They're already outliers. We have one interesting one way over here. That's a much older item. It looks like it's about 24 days. And this is in an unmapped status. And what that means is that this item is not visible on the board. And you would think that it wouldn't be possible for an item to have started but not be visible in a Jira board, but you would be wrong. Jira is quite happy to have you not map all of the statuses to a board. So it is possible for something to have just disappeared. It's no longer visible, and those things tend to age very quickly because if we can't see it, we don't do anything with it. So unmapped statuses are also a cause for concern. All right, so the same data, we're looking at aging data again, but looking at it in a slightly different perspective and giving it a slightly bit more data to it. We can show when the item is blocked or stalled and when it's been expedited. So a little bit of a definition for those 3 terms. Blocked means that there is some reason that is preventing that work from continuing to move. Perhaps we're blocked on a different team. Perhaps we are stopped because we need to wait for an approval. Perhaps we're stopped because there's some environment that needs to be up and that environment is not available to us right now. So blocked means the work is unable to move. It doesn't mean that the people are blocked. It means that the work is unable to move. So that would be blocked. Stalled means that there's just been no activity. We could have worked on it had we had capacity, but we haven't had capacity. And so for whatever reason, it's just not moving. So blocked and stalled are both cases where the work is not moving, but they have different reasons. Stalled means we've got no good reason for not moving it, whereas blocked means we do have a good reason. The last bar that is not actually visible on the chart here is expedited, which means that it's a different class of service. We have said that this work is more important than any other work that could be on the board right now. And in this case, there is none here, but quite often we see a lot of expedited, where we've said this item is most critical and we have to get to it right away. If you're unclear about expedited, imagine that you've got a highway with a whole bunch of cars going down it, and then an ambulance comes along. And as that ambulance comes along, it is expedited, and everybody else pulls over to the side of the road because that's the nature of expedited work. When that ambulance comes down the road, everybody else pulls over to the side. And that's okay, but when we absolutely need to get that one piece of work done fast, we need to get the ambulance to the hospital. The problem is, imagine if every third vehicle on the highway was an ambulance. Then nobody else would go anywhere. Because the moment we have expedited work, it slows down the rest of the system. And if we have too much of it, we have a problem. So what this chart is showing us is how many items are expedited. So we can see at a glance what's going on, and we can start to make determinations. We can say, there's a lot of expedited work here. Nothing else is getting done. Is that a problem for us? And it probably is.
Mike, we have a couple of questions here.
Yes.
So Peter is asking if you're managing blocked and stalled items with labels or statuses.
The tool will allow you to indicate them in multiple different ways. So stalled by default means, if you haven't configured anything, it means that 5 days have passed and there's been no activity. So you didn't update a description, you didn't change a status. If there were subtasks, you didn't move a subtask. So there's no activity on the ticket at all for 5 days. But stalled could mean you've put it into a specific status. So you might have an active column and a completed column. Like if we were playing the Get Kanban game, a lot of things get split into that, an active and a completed. Well, stalled might be that you're sitting in the completed. There's no reason we couldn't move it to the next column. We just haven't had capacity. We've chosen not to. The work is not moving. So that's for stalled. We can either specify the number of days before it becomes stalled or the status that it goes into, and that would indicate stalled. For blocked, there's actually 3 ways that we could indicate blocked. One is a status. One is the flag, because most people in Jira use the flag to indicate that it's blocked. Most teams do that, some teams actually use the flag for something else, so you can disable that. And the third thing is that a lot of people will use a link. So they'll put in a link that says this item is blocked on this other item. And as soon as I find that link, I indicate it that it's blocked. And once that link is removed, it's now unblocked. So those are the ways that we can configure it to be blocked or stalled. Just sort of finishing off that thought, expedited is always one of the priority statuses, and we just tell it which priority is considered expedited. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you, Mike.
Okay. So again, looking at aging work, but looking at it with some slightly different eyes. So now we can look at the issue and we can see where it fits in the hierarchy. We can see that this first item here, Scraggly Ridge, is associated with the epic. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. These are all randomly generated text strings, by the way, because this has all been anonymized. So we can see that these stories belong to these epics. If we had a larger hierarchy, we would see the hierarchy all the way back up. We can start to see some things like what status it's in right now. The little googly eyes beside analysis indicates that that status is not mapped to anything on the board. It's invisible. You can't see it. And so that's why that one is likely aging very quickly. You can also see that if these items have been assigned to a fixed version, we can see that. If this was a Scrum board, then it would also indicate what sprint it's in. So there's a whole bunch of information that goes in here. Who actually updated it last? What the age is. So it's just the same information, but with a little bit more context, a little bit more understanding. Then we move along to work in progress. So work in progress is the third of the 4 flow measurements that we're talking about. And this is one of the most, well, they're all critical, but the WIP is the only one that is under our active control. We make a decision about WIP. We decide as a team whether we're going to start the next item or not. None of the other flow metrics are decisions. They're all effects from the decision we made. So the aging will continue to happen until we fix something. Cycle time continues until the work is done. But WIP is a choice. We choose whether or not to start the next item. So this is a really good one to keep an eye on. We've got a lot of different things in here that we can talk about. We can see the total amount of WIP in each case. We can see at the beginning that it wasn't so bad. It was about 5 items in progress, but then down around Christmas time, December 28th, January 1st, all of a sudden that WIP climbed up and then it came down a little bit. So we can start to see patterns in the data. We are trending upwards. We have the dashed trend line there that indicates WIP is going up. And as a good general rule, although there's exceptions for every rule, but as a rule, lowering our WIP is going to increase our efficiency and improve our quality. If we allow WIP to grow in an uncontrolled manner, everything gets worse. We become far less effective at delivering anything, and our quality tends to drop as well. So we've got some color coding in here to indicate how old these specific items are. So we can see that the lighter color at the top means that it just came in today or it came in a couple of days ago. The items that are down below indicate that it's been open for a while. We can see that some of these have been open for 4 weeks or more, and that's a problem. We also have some white ones up at the top where we know when it stopped, but we don't know when it started. So we called this out in the data quality report, that there were a bunch of items that we didn't get included in our cycle time because we didn't know when it started. But in the WIP, we've got some idea of when it might have been started. And so this graphs out the white areas show what might have happened, but we don't know for sure because the start date was unknown. Bad data. All right, so exactly the same data, but this time instead of grouping it by age, we're grouping it by the whether it's blocked or stalled or active. It occurs to me I didn't talk about the lines on the underside, but it's the same for this chart and the last one, so I'll talk about them now. On the underside, it's an indication of items that are completed. So how many items completed on that day? Because sometimes looking at the WIP, it's not obvious how many items actually finished. Even though the WIP dropped by a certain amount, things might have gotten added. So the green on the underside is just how many items completed on that day. You'll notice that there's 2 different shades of green. The darker green is work that we know when it started and we know when it finished. And the lighter items is we only know that it finished. We have no idea when it started. So blocked, stalled, and active, as we can see with this team, that there was a period in here where we had an awful lot of stuff that was stalled. And there was a period in early December where there was an awful lot of stuff blocked. And so we can start to see patterns in the data. And if we go back and start to look at that, well, what things could we improve? How could we get better? Let's start to look at patterns. It's really important that I don't care about a single data point. If you had one bad item or one bad week even, I'm really not concerned. When we start to have a pattern of problems, that's when I do care. And we need to address those and fix them. All right, one more daily WIP, and this is an interesting one because it tells us something about our focus. This is daily WIP grouped by the parent ticket. So if we have a whole bunch of stories or tasks that relate up to an epic, that maybe relate up from there up to an initiative or to something else, this tells us how many of those larger items are in play. And we can see that in the early time in October here, we mostly were focused on one epic with a couple of other items periodically going. But by the time we got into January, we had multiple epics going at the same time, and that indicates that we might have a problem with focus, that we might be scattering our attention all over the place instead of getting one thing done and getting it all the way completed. This doesn't prove that we've got a problem with focus. It could indicate that we're just really bad at slicing our stories, but one of those things is going to be true. So this is an interesting chart, and I've seen charts that just look like an entire rainbow, where you've got so many colors in play because there is no focus at all. Having that discussion with teams about lack of focus is something that doesn't really go well unless you've got good data backing you up, which is why I always bring this chart into the conversation. People don't like to be told that they are not focused. All right, so those were the basic flow metrics, the ones that I focus on most at the beginning, unless I have a reason to look at something else first. But what else might Jira have? Jira actually has a lot of interesting stuff. So let's take a look at some of the other things that we might find in there. So first of all, before we get to that, a little bit of theory. We do want to focus, as we're starting to improve our system, we want to be balancing across three main things, and they are effectiveness, efficiency, and predictability. Effectiveness is all about getting the right things to our customers at the right time. Did we actually satisfy the customer with what they needed when they needed it? Efficiency, or flow efficiency specifically, is about how good are we at keeping the work moving? Did the work get blocked, or was the work moving along smoothly? And then we have predictability. How good are we at anticipating what's coming? If somebody comes and says, how long will this big chunk of work take? Can we give them a reasonably accurate number? What is that predictability? So if we're doing some kind of probabilistic forecasting, predictability is very important. The problem with efficiency is that there's two different kinds of efficiency, and that we often focus on the wrong one. What we should be focusing on is flow efficiency, and what we often focus on is resource efficiency. Resource efficiency is keeping the people busy. When we have conversations like, what's Amy working on today? Or what did Bob do tomorrow? Or is there enough work on Carol's plate? Does she have enough to keep her busy? That's resource efficiency. We're now focusing on the people and how busy they are. What we should be focusing on is the work continuing to flow, or is it getting blocked or stalled? We should be focusing on the work and getting it done. And the reason it's so important, I like to use a highway analogy for this. Imagine for a moment that you're looking at an empty highway and you start putting more cars onto that highway. Resource efficiency is how many cars fit on the highway. We're making best use of that pavement by packing more and more cars onto the highway. Whereas flow efficiency is measuring how many cars actually got to their destination. And as we start with an empty highway and we start to put more and more cars onto it, we find that at the beginning, it doesn't matter what we measure, whether we're measuring resource efficiency or flow efficiency, adding more cars makes both of them better. But there comes a point, and for a highway it's about 60% capacity, where making one of those better makes the other one worse. And so if we are adding more cars once we're over 60% capacity, we get fewer and fewer cars to their destination, to the point that when we have an infinite number of cars on the highway, there is nobody getting to their destination. We've all seen traffic jams. We all know how this works. So we want to make sure that we're measuring the right thing, and that's flow efficiency, not resource efficiency. So what would that look like? Well, flow efficiency is looking at, if we look at the bottom right chart, we're looking at how much time are we spending adding value to the ticket, divided by the total amount of time that that ticket was in progress. So if it was, the ticket was open for a week, but we really only spent 4 hours of that week actually adding value to it, then it's the 4 hours divided by a week as a percentage. That would be our flow efficiency. Flow efficiency is quite commonly below 10%. So it's very common for the numbers to be very, very small. Well, what if we look at our Jira data and we start using that same calculation based on what we know about blocked, stalled, and active work? How would we plot that out? Well, this is data that came directly out of Jira. And what we find is that there's an awful lot of work that's either right at 100% or very close to 100%. And this is this green line that goes up diagonally. Now, truly, I don't believe that the things are that precise. I really don't believe that we're having anything at 100% efficiency. But I do believe that that's what the data in Jira tells us, because I don't think that we're marking things as blocked or indicating them as stalled really when we should. So I noticed that there's an awful lot of data that is at that point that's right, very close to 100. And then there's an awful lot of work that is less than 30%. And that's the orange down here. And then there's a bunch of stuff in between. But there's not a lot in between. So what this data tells me, and I've seen this, I'm only just playing with this chart now. This is something I just introduced in the last couple of weeks. But the trend that I'm seeing is that almost all the data is either 100% or it's less than 30%. And that tells me that when things get blocked, they get blocked a lot. So that's a good piece of information that we can take back to our decision making, that we can say that if this is going to be blocked at all, it's likely going to be blocked a lot. Perhaps we should do what we can to prevent it from ever being blocked. So I do want to call out the big yellow part up here that the data accuracy to calculate flow efficiency is likely going to be very small, very low. So don't assume that you're going to get good data out of this. But as I mentioned before, the fact that we're graphing it at all means that people are more likely to want to improve that data to make it more accurate so that we can make better decisions based on it. All right, another thing, we've talked about expedited work, but sometimes it's worth just focusing. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, somebody was asking here if the data is based on blocked or stalled tickets.
It's based on both. So if the work is, the only case that we care about for the green here is work that is active. So it is not blocked and it is not stalled.
Mm.
If it is either blocked or stalled, it's in the red down below.
Daniel, that answers the question. All right.
Okay. Expedited work. Some teams almost never have expedited work, and other teams are absolutely swamped in expedited work. So I have this chart in here so that when we do have a lot of expedited work, we can look at interesting patterns. We can see things like this item, even though it was expedited, stayed open for 400 days. This item here had been open for over 500 days as expedited work, and then somebody said, oh, it's not expedited anymore, but they still didn't close it. It remained open for a long time after that. So we can start to see interesting patterns in the data about when things become expedited and when they don't. And sometimes we'll see with tickets that it goes from expedited back to non-expedited, back to expedited again, and then back. And it will do that repeatedly without getting closed, staying open all the time. And yet expedited is supposed to mean this is our top priority. All right, so let's talk about estimation a little bit, because I know that one of the things that Jira encourages is putting story points estimates or t-shirt size estimates into our data. So let's talk about this. Humans are inherently bad at estimating, and largely this is because we estimate these things up at the top, level of effort and complexity, and we completely ignore all this other stuff down below. And so estimates tend to be garbage. But when you tell a team that their estimates are probably not correct, they tend to get very affronted by that. They don't like to hear that their estimates are bad. Everybody just believes, well, if we put more time into it, we can make them better. And the reality is we can't. So I did a chart for that so that we can actually see how accurate your data is. And what we find is that when we graph the actual estimate that we put on the story against the length of time it actually took to get done, we find there is almost never a correlation. And when there is a correlation, it's weak. So we can see that this 2-point story here went anywhere from 1 day all the way up to 14 days with data points all the way through. The larger the circle, the more data points there were at that point. We've got a bigger one down below that we can start to see clusters of data, but again, there is no correlation. And so when I'm having a conversation with teams about, is there any value to doing these story points estimates? Of course, they all say yes. And then I show them their data and I say, now that you've seen this data, do you still think there's value in doing these estimates? And the answer is usually no. But until they've seen data, they don't believe it. So that's why I built this chart, entirely for the purpose of convincing people that story points estimates are a waste. Then one more thing that I like to graph in here is that Jira allows us to link stories. I mentioned that already for the purposes of blocking. So we can say this story is dependent on by this one is satisfied by that, this one's blocked by that, this is related to in some way, but it doesn't give you any good way of visualizing what those relationships look like. And so the chart goes and pulls out all those dependencies and just gives them a nice relationship. So we can see what everything is here. Okay, so a couple of random things. I've only talked about Kanban. What if my team uses Scrum? Well, yes, this is a Kanban user group, and so that's why I focused on Kanban. But there are charts specific to Scrum. There is a burn down chart that goes across the entire time period that we're looking at, so we can start to see patterns in there. Several of the charts, like aging, are going to add extra columns, add extra information if you are on a Scrum board. But I do want to stress that every chart we've talked about, all of the flow metrics, the expedited, the blocked, installed, all of those things are just as applicable to Scrum as they are to Kanban. So if you're a Scrum team, all of this is still good for you. Just random things. Some of you may have already been thinking, the colors you use, they're burning my eyes. I hate this light mode. The reports do also appear in dark mode. So if your system is set to dark mode, you will see it in dark mode. But also, if you decide that you hate the colors I picked, everything is customizable. There is some points in here where we can customize the data. So when we talk about our cycle time of how long does it take to get stuff done, we need to be very clear on what the start point means. At what point are we started, and at what point are we finished? And Jira, of course, gives you no way to specify that in the tool. There is no way to say, this is where we start the clock and this is where we stop. And so this tool allows you to specify that in a whole variety of different ways. I could say, well, when you start the clock when we enter this column, or we start the clock when we enter this status, or we start the clock on created. So there's all different things that we can do to make it work for your team. How you define blocked, stalled, and expedited is customizable. I talked about that already. You can do it by a status, by a link, by the flag. We can exclude issues. Sometimes we get one data point that is so awful that it makes the chart tiny and you can't make any sense of it. So we can exclude specific issues if we want to. You can also change the order of the charts so that you can see what you want what order do you want things to be in. And you can have multiples of the same kind of chart. So I showed that already with throughput, where I tended to graph two of the throughputs at the same time, one by type and one by how it was completed. And so we can just do that. We can have the same chart showing up multiple times with different sets of data.
All right. Mike, we have a comment here from Ramesh. Ramesh, would you like to comment or to bring it up?
Yeah, sure, I can comment. Yeah. So I've seen in some context, because sometimes when some people are looking at the data, they forget the context, that why did this happen and why did this change happen, whether it is efficiency or so on, and they forget that there was an event that happened at that time. So if we have certain events, if we markers to show that there were these events that actually, so we can kind of see the pattern, are we having the similar events, and what does that do to our efficiency and so on. So that was the context I was talking about.
Yes, and that is an important thing that we should talk about, that when we discuss as a team, the data does tell us what happened, but it doesn't tell us why. It doesn't give us that context. And so it is important to have those conversations around, well, look at what happened here. Well, yes, that was Christmas time, and so there was a holiday, or this was summer break, or something had happened at this point, and so it's natural that these things happened. We had a code freeze.
Yeah,
whatever the reason, the context is important.
Team members changed, right? So team members changed, and there was again reforming of the team and so on. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely, very important. All right, so everything we've talked about so far is looking at a single board for a single team, but sometimes we want to look at things at a wider space. And so I just want to point out here that the chart works just as well. We can pull in data sources across multiple projects. So in this case, we've got 3 different teams, 3 different boards, all being graphed on the same scatter plot. And so it's color-coded. The board that was maple is in one color, the board that was willow is another, the board that was cedar is yet another. And so we can start to look at aggregated results. We can look at aging based on different criteria. So aggregating data across projects is also possible, and it allows different kinds of conversations. Whereas the standard report that we would look at is useful for a single team to make decisions about themselves. This aggregated might be at a higher level. It might be at a program level. If we're in something like a safe model, it might be our RTE that's walking through this and talking about this is what's going on across the entire program, so we can start to see patterns at that level. So I'm not going to walk through again. It's largely the same charts, but the point is that we are pulling them in and we're showing slightly different values and slightly different things in the data when we're aggregated than when we're looking at an individual board. So now, what if you didn't want all the pretty charts? What if you just want raw data because you've already got Excel sheets or you've already got a tool like an Actionable Agile or like Troy McGinnis's spreadsheet that you just want to pull data into? Yes, the tool does that as well. It can export CSV files that give you all of the same data that you can then pull into another tool. This particular one that was generated here was for Actionable Agile because I wanted to be able to export some data into that or import data into that so that I could see what their charts were doing. So if all you want is raw data, we can also do that. All right. So this is where I stop talking for a little bit and you ask your questions or your comments or your thoughts. The link on the left is for the tool itself. It's called JiraMetrics. It has its own website. This QR code will take you there. The one on the right is all about me for more information about the kinds of things that I talk about. As Fernando mentioned at the beginning, I am a very long-time Agile coach. I do offer support for this tool as well as doing regular Agile coaching. So if your company wants to use this tool and you don't want to figure it all out yourself, and you have budget to throw at me, I am happy to come and set it up for you, or you can just set it up yourself. The tool is open source. It does not cost you a penny to use if you want to set it up yourself.
All right. Chris Chapman is asking about your merch store. I suppose we can talk about that offline.
Sorry, about my what?
Your merch store. He says he wants your mug.
Okay.
And Kadrin, I think you have a question. Would you like to bring it up?
Yeah, sure. Hey, thanks so much for this. I'm fascinated by all this stuff and love the work that you do. Particularly the estimate accuracy charts. I often do something similar with teams, and I've had this idea in the back of my head around quantifying that further using like a Pearson's correlation coefficient. But to be honest, it's been so long since I've done any formal statistics. I'm not sure if that's valid or not. Just curious if you had a view on that. I thought it'd be interesting. Make the business case for it to actually
yes, and I would like to do that. That is on my to-do list to come up with an actual coefficient, a number that I can point at and say this is where it is. But I just haven't had the time to exactly dig into the stats that I would need to know because it's not at the tip of my tongue. I would have to go and do some research on the math for that.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
All right. Anyone else has a question? Or I saw it in the chat box. There were some side conversations on some topics that looked interesting. So if anyone wants to bring those up, this is the time to. In the meantime, I do have some questions. Could you, Mike, mention something about the setup requirements for this? I'm thinking you may need some sort of server-side configuration for this, any certificates or any permissions?
No, you don't. This sits entirely outside. The code is written in Ruby, but it'll run either on a Ruby runtime or on a Java runtime, and all you need is something installed on your own local machine, and it talks to Jira through the published APIs. So there's nothing to install on the Jira side. You either need a personal access token or what was the other one called? If you're on Jira Cloud, there's one kind of token, and if you're on Jira Server or Data Center, there's a different kind of token. It's all documented on the website of exactly where you go and how you get the token. But the point is, you just tell the tool, this is my configuration token, and it goes and starts pulling everything automatically. Yeah, if the tokens don't work for some reason, there is a kludge involving cookies, but I really don't recommend you go there. It's also fully documented, but it is a kludge.
I was wondering if there is something organizations need to do for the tool to work, or is just something that you just do out of the box? So is there anything special companies would need to do on their side? Because you know what I'm thinking is some organizations close down their Jira implementations and they don't give you permissions, and so is that an assumption?
If you can view the board through a web browser, you can get access to the data through the tool, and that's the restriction. If you can't view it through the web browser, then no, you're locked out.
But that should be enough. Cool. And my other question would be in terms of data storage. I'm guessing that you're extracting the data and storing it locally somehow?
Yeah, I'm just storing it in flat files.
Flat files. So is this an incremental export, or does a full dump each time?
It is an incremental export because the exports can be lengthy. It can take if you've got 1,000 issues to pull out of Jira, it can take a long time. So it does do incremental just since the last time you did a download.
All right. Cool. Very nice. What about some other questions? Katia has a question.
Yes, if I may, please. So, Mike, just a question. Like, I think there's a number of tools that try to address that metrics in Jira challenge. You mentioned one of them, Actionable Agile. There's Nave, there's Quantify. So what effectively kind of motivated you to come up with your own tool, and how yours compares within that Jira extensions for metrics market?
The big driver for me to do this in the first place was that I was getting frustrated not being able to get good metrics. And while there are tools like Actionable Agile, that requires my clients to have purchased and installed that tool. And getting a client to do that is outrageous. One client that I was at recently, it took over a year to go through the approval process. And in fact, they didn't actually install it until after I'd left. So it's outrageous to be able to get anything installed on these instances. And so I needed a tool that would give me access to data without going through a formal approval process. And I discovered that the API worked amazingly well for that. Now, the API is fairly horrible. I don't recommend that you write stuff to the API yourself, but if you ever choose to, I've written up all of my notes on that, and I've published that on my blog.
So that was the reason I was asking earlier if you need anything set up on the server side, because I know that organizations sometimes are very difficult about that. So that answers the question really. It's essentially work around that problem. Chris Chan?
Yes.
Yeah, just one clarification. Mike, you mentioned you were not able to get good metrics from these type of tools. Does that mean you don't trust their data quality? What I noticed that you are kind of paying a lot of attention to that aspect.
Well, no, the first step was I couldn't even get data at all. There is no direct export out of Jira. So they give you they give you the control chart, and they give you the cumulative flow diagram, both of which are broken in different ways. And there's no easy way to export any of that, so I can't visualize it myself. Okay. And so I got frustrated and I wrote a tool. And I don't want to make it sound like I just sat down one night and I wrote a tool. This has been over many years. I was at one client and I needed something, so I built something very primitive that got me some raw data, no charts, just some raw data out. And then I moved on from that client. And of course, because I built it on their time, they owned it. So at the next client, I had to start all over again. And I did this about 3 times before I got frustrated rebuilding the same tool. And I said, I'm just doing this on my own time, and I'm going to release it as open source.
That does help. Thank you. No more questions.
And that's how open source projects usually emerge and evolve, right? So out of a necessity and solving a problem. So Chris has something to add.
I have something to add.
No, you had your hand up.
I saw you raising your hand, so I thought you had
No, I was clapping.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Clapping.
Well,
I agree with I agree with everything Mike's been putting down here. It's awesome. Necessity being the motherhood of invention. I've been there. So that's why I've started writing some of my own tools as well, as the same frustrations. And so I totally know where he's coming from. Really appreciative of what he's done with this tool. This is amazing.
Yeah, if we're going to be coaching teams and getting them better, we need to be able to show them data. And that's, I mean, there's only so much that you can tell with anecdotes and with stories. There comes a point that you need to be able to show them, this is your data. Let's talk about this. Definitely. And to do that, you need to be able to extract the data.
Definitely.
Yep.
Yeah, and I've tried, because I usually say that the best tool I find in Jira for metrics is the export to Excel function. So get the data out. But that requires people building up their Excel files, and so this tool really helps getting over that hump. Right? Fantastic. So any other questions from anyone? Anyone has anything to add or to ask about the tool or about metrics or about any of these topics we've covered? So, Catherine.
Yeah, sorry to be so vocal. And let me know if this is getting too technical. I'm interested in the cycle time calculation, particularly over multiple time zones, how you figure out day starts and ends.
Oh, yes. The time zones are an absolute nightmare in Jira. What you'll find is that the API returns things to you in the time zone that the data was originally created. So if you've got teams spread across time zones, as most of my clients do, you're going to find the dates, the timestamps that come back are all scattered across time zones. And so I have to normalize them to a standard one. And so one of the configuration options in the tool is to say, I want the report in this time zone, and then it converts everything down to that time zone so that we're doing the right calculations. Now, sometimes I only get dates back, and that becomes problematic because I have to assume that the date was represented in the time zone of the report, and that's not always 100% accurate, but I work with the data as best I can.
Mm-hmm. But what moment in time do you use for starting and stopping the clock? Is that
well, that depends on how you've configured the tool. So if you say I want to start on an entry into this status, then I look at the time zone. I look at the timestamp for that particular status, normalize it to the right time zone. That's my start.
That's your start. Cool. Ambrose has a question.
Yes, thank you so much. So I just wanted to find out, Mike, from a data perspective, have you ever seen any clients who's probably had issues with plugging JiraMetrics to their Jira, for an example, maybe for an example in the financial sector, we're trying to make sure that, is it encrypted, for an example, are we
No,
safe?
There's nothing that's encrypted. Most of my clients are in the financial space. As much as they would like to lock it down, they really can't lock down the API. I discovered at one bank that they jumped through hoops to get everything locked down from a UI perspective, but my script continued to run. They knew this. This was no surprise to the client. I had been very open and transparent with them. I said, I'm going through the API, I'm doing this, I'm getting this data. And they tried their hardest to lock the API down so I couldn't get in. Because I was their trial experiment. They weren't trying to lock me out. I want to be very clear on that. I was open with them. They knew what I was doing. They were okay with what I was doing, but they were using me as a guinea pig to try and lock down the API, and they could not.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mike. I remember 2023, last year in Banff, when I met you in person, you spoke about this, and it's beautiful to actually be here and witness you walking us through this. Thank you so much.
Alan has a question. I think he's asking about which bank that was. I'm not sure if that's confidential.
Yeah, I can't name my clients, but I can say that in my 25 years in the business, I've been probably half of my clients have been financial.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure I'm not a client of that bank that wasn't able to secure the data. I'm wondering, I don't know if it's relevant here, but I'm wondering at which point the data is too granular. So a lot of what you showed, I think, talks very clearly and very loudly to leaders, but not necessarily on the team level. So I wonder at which point it's too much information and
well, my use case is actually the opposite. I am using this data to help teams improve. And I often tell them, don't show these metrics to your managers. Because I want managers to be looking at higher level metrics. I want them to be looking at business metrics. What's the value delivered? We invested this much money. How much return did we get on that? That's what management should be looking at. This is all operational data. And this is perfect for the teams. Yes, it is a lot of data and it can be overwhelming, which is why I facilitate the conversation and I say, let's only look at a subset of the charts. But this is for them to get better at what they're doing. So I'm using it very specifically at the team level, and I'm trying to steer management away from this operational data. Now, that first level of management right above the team, they still need to look at it. But the further you get up in the organization, the less they should care about this kind of data, and the more they should be caring about actual financial data.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, my experience on that has been that usually teams tend to use Jira for team level stuff that is not customer recognizable, so it actually doesn't aggregate up very well, right? It's kind of a shame because you need your upper management to see this stuff, but then you cannot go to the data to see, you need to aggregate it again, and that needs to be done manually most of the time. That's an extra hook. Although you do some aggregation based on parent-child relationships, right?
Right.
So that may help there if you, because somehow you get some configuration of Jira that reflects that. So your stories and tasks, those are team level stuff, but your epics or features are customer recognizable. That aggregation might work going up, but you know, need to be careful.
Yes, and there's some real ugliness in the data around that because in the last couple of years, Jira changed the way they stored parents. And it used to go from multiple different ways to store different kinds of parents. So one way to store an epic, one way to store a feature, one way to store something else, to a more standardized approach. So the tool has to go and look at multiple different things. Well, look here first, and if you don't find what you're looking for, then look over here, then look over here. There's some real ugliness around parent.
Yeah. And on top of that, the tool will not help you with consistency on how it's done, right? So
right,
you may be creating parents one way here and another way there, and then things don't really aggregate up. All right. Who else has a question or a comment or an observation about the metrics we've seen? Have it.
Hi. Well, thank you so much for walking us through this. It was really interesting, and I will be taking a look at the tool. Thanks for taking time to create it.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I took a few points while you were walking us through the presentation. Just the clarification. So when you're saying expedited ticket, and you said like they have a priority, did you mean like they have a higher priority than everybody else, like all the other tickets, or did you mean
yes, that's generally Jira gives you this whole priority field. So you might have 5 different levels of priority. Yep. I really try to get people down to 2 levels. You've got standard work and you've got expedited work. And expedited work should really be done before your standard work.
Okay.
And so that's what we're graphing out. It's what are those items that are more important than everything else? And it's a class of service. And classes of service, although sometimes they really do happen and we have to manage them, when we are using a lot of classes of service, it really makes a mess of predictability and it makes a mess of the system. So as much as possible, we'd like to reduce the number of special cases that we have and just sort of treat everything the same. Not always possible. You know, the ambulance does have to be given priority when it goes down the highway. But it would be nice if we could have fewer ambulances.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, it was a little confusing for me. So I was wondering what's happening there. Are we assuming everything else does not have a priority? But okay, that makes sense.
Everything else is just standard priority. And we should be dealing with standard things as oldest first. So the thing that is oldest gets done before the thing that is younger than that.
Got it.
Unless we said it was a special case.
Right. Okay. So if it is a special case, then what?
Then we give it higher priority. If I'm looking for a next piece of work and there's something expedited on the board, I should be jumping on that.
Okay. All right. And there was this thing called time adding value. So is that the time spent refining the ticket?
No, this is all after the ticket is started. Refinement is the activity leading up to start. So the work is not ready until we've finished refining it. I'm talking mostly at a team level. When we look at the larger workflow, refinement might actually have been part of the whole overall lead time. But we're really focused at the team level of it's already been refined. Now we've started it. Now we're starting to count the time adding value after that point. So refinement is typically before we even start the clock.
So how do we know if a ticket has been or has not been refined or is ready?
Well, we're assuming that the work would not have started if it hadn't been refined. If we are starting work that hasn't been refined, then we're probably going to have a lot of data quality problems because likely Stuff will get blocked partway through because we didn't actually think it through. We didn't understand what was necessary. We didn't understand our definition of done. So there's likely going to be a lot of data quality issues if we haven't done refinement.
Okay.
It's not a guarantee, but likely.
Like in this specific case, though, because how I understood it as was time adding value was from the inception of the ticket till the time it's been delivered. But now I'm hearing it's more about when it's been picked up and work has started on it till the time it's being delivered.
Okay, the thing that makes this conversation difficult is that there's multiple cycle times. Every cycle time has a start and a finish. We say we're just going to start the clock here and we're going to stop the clock here. But on a specific workflow, we might have multiple starts and multiple stops. And so that's what makes the conversation difficult, that there will absolutely be some cycle times where we started before refinement, and there will be some where we started after refinement. And so we need to have our definition of exactly where are those start and end points if we're going to have a reasonable conversation about measuring those cycle times.
Right. And those can be marked in specific fields, like for the purpose of measuring this cycle time through this tool?
Well, it's not in a field. That's the trick. It's that we tell the tool that we start the clock when you enter the status. We start the clock when you get onto the board. We start the status when you created the ticket. Whatever the rule is, we start the status when this label was added to the ticket. Whatever the criteria is, we're specifying it in the tool and saying, this is my criteria for starting, and this is my criteria for stopping, and everything in between is my cycle time.
Love it. That's nice. Thank you so much. Maybe like one last thing. Is there a way that you could suggest doing sorry about that. Assessing how much time is being spent on different types of tasks? So
yes.
Okay.
Yes, so we can group if we look at the charts of we've got different ways of here. Let me bring up let me share again. We can group the scatter plot any way we want, or any of the charts. We can group them however we want. So if I come back, I've scrolled too far. So if we look at this, we can see that we're grouping by default by the type of work. But there's nothing that says we couldn't group it any way we wanted. We could have grouped it by a label. We could have grouped it by type. We could have grouped it by the ticket number. So the groupings are arbitrary, and you specify that in the configuration. It's just by default, it goes by type.
Got it. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mike.
You're welcome.
Fantastic. I have here another question from Sean. He had to leave, unfortunately, but he left the question behind because he mentions another question about permissions. He tried to access your site, JiraMetrics.org, from the company computer, and the site itself is blocked. So I'm guessing the question is, do you know of any workaround? First, have you encountered that problem? Because now is the tool...
Well, this is a common, firewalls like this usually block anything they don't recognize. And so when a new website goes live, it's usually blocked for weeks, if not months, before it finally gets unblocked. This is a new domain. I registered the domain a couple of weeks ago. The documentation used to be up on GitHub itself, and I decided that it was becoming too difficult for me to keep the documentation up to date on there, so I moved it to its own website. So it's a brand new domain. Yes, I expect that it will get blocked by some firewalls.
Oh, okay.
Most companies have an internal policy that when you hit that block, there's a link that says, give me a reason to unblock this, and you just say, this is documentation that I need, and it gets unblocked.
So you need to work with your company to just get it through the firewall.
Yes. But that's the reason it's going to be blocked, is because it's a new domain.
All right, cool. More questions?
I have one. Mike, how hard is that to add more metrics or charts?
Oh, how would you add more charts?
Yeah, maybe.
Well, it is possible to add charts without actually touching the base source code. It's just not documented. So if that's something that you want to do, then just reach out to me and I'll help you walk through that. But yes, generally speaking, most people just use the charts that are already in there. Each chart is highly customizable, so there's a lot of things you can do with it. So for example, if you're trying to do WIP, but you want to do WIP in a very different way, you can just use the existing WIP chart and provide some customization, and you'll get new groupings and new everything else. But if you did want to build something entirely new, it is possible to do that without modifying the original source code.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
All right.
Or you could just submit a patch because, well, it is open source. And I do accept contributions.
Cool.
Thank you, Mike, so much for the talk. It was really interesting, and great job on the tool as well. It looks like a great contribution.
Oh, thank you.
It solves a very real problem for many people, so it's definitely something to try out. And thank you everybody else for participating, for your questions and for your comments. Stay tuned for announcements for the next sessions. I already have something lined up for December. There's going to be a case study presentation at some point during December. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next.